I'll admit that I have had and continue to have preconceived notions and judgments around psychedelics. And at the time, I didn't think our culture, or I, for that matter, was ready for this conversation. I thought, whoa, this is really bold of Michael to do this in 2018, which at the time it was. But now I've noticed, and I think you are the reason for part of this shift. I've seen, first of all, more articles about it, more stories about it, more people who've engaged with the experience of psychedelics. And I think something is happening in the culture. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, what's happened since 2018 is I never would have imagined how many studies are going on, how much research is being done, and how many people are seeking psychedelic therapy. And, in one way...
Would you say you were part of that change, though? Because when you wrote this book, which
it was pretty fringe.
Yes.
And I really didn't think that there was a large audience for a book on psychedelics. I was just personally fascinated. But yeah, I mean, I think the book, I hear especially from scientists, that it became okay to study this after the book came out.
How to Change Your Mind is such a perfect title, too.
Thank you.
I love that.
It's what it's about.
What the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. I thought, well, if it does all that, I'm going to read this book.
It's a big promise.
That's a big promise.
But what got me really interested and making me realize, so I had very little experience of psychedelics personally. I was afraid of them. I didn't think I was sturdy enough psychologically to have a big psychedelic trip. And I didn't do it when I was in college. But I wrote an article about a study where they were giving psychedelics to people who had cancer diagnoses, many of them terminal.
And was this Roland Griffith's article?
Yes. Roland Griffith.
Roland Griffith, who I interviewed,
who was
in his last dying days.
I know. That's an amazing interview.
Yes.
How do we awaken and stay awake to the wonder of what our existence is?
And he was so calm about the experience of dying, yes. And so you read Roland Griffith's article.
So he was doing a study, he hadn't published it yet, giving psychedelics, psilocybin specifically, magic mushrooms in pill form, to people who had cancer diagnoses. And I interviewed about a dozen of them. And they told me stories of personal
May I just tell people who he was? He's a renowned researcher of psychedelics at Johns Hopkins.
Yes, he really got what's called the psychedelic renaissance started with his research.
Because he wrote this paper on the mystical and spiritual experience of it all, right?
Yeah, in 2006.
Yeah.
And that really launched the whole revival of psychedelic research, which had been a big thing in the 50s and 60s. I didn't realize it. But in the 50s, LSD was considered a wonder drug. There were 6 international conferences on LSD alone. There were...
in the 50s?
In the 50s, up till 1965, from 50 to... So we
and
think
then
of
it just
psychedelics...
got banned, and also people said...
the drug war.
The drug war.
Yeah. And President Nixon, who starts the drug war, said that the drug war... There's a quote that he gave to John Ehrlichman, his domestic policy advisor, that we're going after LSD to get the hippies and cannabis to get the blacks. And those were his 2 enemies. And that's what the drug war was really about.
Yes.
And so anyway, there had been all this very promising research. LSD was being used to treat alcoholism with a lot of success. So I didn't know this whole backstory. I thought of psychedelics as a 60s thing, but it's really a 50s thing. And there was this promising research that gets shut down. And we lose like 30 years of research that is just now resumed.
So some people are drawn, we know, to psychedelics because they are suffering from mental illness or mental trauma. Not mental illness, mental trauma. Mm-hmm. Because I think if you're suffering from mental illness, a lot of people shouldn't take it if you are.
There are definitely people who shouldn't mess around with these substances. People at any risk of schizophrenia, if you have a relative that has schizophrenia, usually bipolar, they don't they don't want you in the studies.
You need to leave these drugs alone.
Yeah. But people struggling with addiction, anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, trauma. Yeah, those are mental disorders that...
PTSD.
Yeah.
We're going to talk to somebody later. So some are spiritual seekers, some are suffering from mental traumas, and others are just looking for this experience or seem to be doing it for fun.
Yeah, I mean, people, the term recreational is regarded as a negative. I mean, to recreate ourselves doesn't seem that bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are people who are just doing it for thrills, going to concerts.
But in every single instance, isn't it about changing consciousness?
Yeah, it
Yes.
does change consciousness. But the set and setting are very important. So the context in which you do it, if you do it to go to a Grateful Dead concert, it's one thing. If you do it in a room, I mean, the way psychedelic therapy is done is you're lying down, you're on a couch, you're wearing eye shades, you're listening to music. It's a very internal journey. It's very different than kids taking mushrooms and walking in the woods, where it's all about the sensory thrills.
So if you're using it for therapy, as a lot of people now are,
It's a completely different experience.
it's a guided experience.
Right. And the guide is really important.
So were you reluctant to take, I mean, you were, pretty straightforward guy.
I was terrified.
Were you reluctant to take them yourself?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I was scared for a lot of reasons. One was, would I discover some deep, dark secret about myself? Because people do discover traumas that they're not looking for.
Yes.
That definitely comes up.
I would be afraid of having a psychotic break.
Yeah.
I would be afraid of losing my mind
I was.
and not getting it back.
I was.
You were.
Yeah. But I also found that doing it with a guide creates this safe envelope, this container in which you can really let go.
Okay, so tell us about the time you tell about experiencing your parents in the trees.
Oh, yeah.
I
I
said, oh, Michael is really tripping. But the realization that you had seemed pretty solid. And I am, Michael, I mean, it made me so curious because I'm surrounded by trees. I love trees. I think I have something is going on with me and trees. I don't know what it is.
Me too.
So your experience, tell everybody what that was.
I was doing a dose of LSD.
What does it even look like?
It's a very powerful drug. It's measured in micrograms, not milligrams. And you take a very, very tiny amount. And
So
it's
is
usually
it a
on a piece of
pill
paper.
or in
No.
a powder? Or
It's usually on a piece of blotter paper. They just put a little drop and you put the piece of paper on your tongue, and that's enough. And the experience was, I saw my son, I saw my wife, I saw my parents, and there was this, it was like a tree house being built layer by layer by layer by layer. And it was a kind of a life review. And I emerged from it with this just surge of compassion for these people in my life. And I had this realization, which like 90% of people on psychedelics seem to have, which is the most important thing in the world is love.